Rain hammered against the car windows as David pulled his worn sleeping bag tighter around his shoulders. It was his 43rd night living in his Honda, and the November cold was starting to cut through everything he owned. At 34 years old, he never imagined his life would end up like this. Just 8 months ago, David had a decent apartment, a steady stream of graphic design clients, and enough money in the bank to feel secure. Then everything fell apart. His biggest client went bankrupt, owing him $12,000. 2 other clients followed. The rent on his studio apartment jumped by $600, and suddenly he couldn't make the payment. His landlord wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Now here he was, parked behind a 24-hour laundromat, trying to stay warm while his laptop charged inside. The laundromat manager, a kind woman named Rosa, pretended not to notice that David wasn't actually doing laundry anymore. She just let him sit at the corner table with his computer, buying a single coffee that he'd nursed for hours. David knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. Winter was coming to Oregon, and people froze to death in their cars every year. He'd applied for every apartment, every room for rent, every house-sitting gig he could find. But when you're living in your car with barely $200 to your name, nobody wants to take a chance on you. That's when he saw the listing. It popped up on his phone while he was scrolling through ads at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep because of the cold. The headline seemed too good to be true. Tiny house on wheels, $500, must sell immediately. The photo was terrible. You could barely make out what you were looking at. It showed a small structure that looked more like a shed on a trailer than an actual house. The description was just as vague. 150 square feet, needs work, must remove from property within 1 week, cash only, serious buyers only. David stared at that ad for a full hour. $500. He had exactly $473 left in the world. But he'd been picking up odd jobs wherever he could find them. A day of moving furniture here, a quick logo design there. He could probably scrape together $500 in a couple of days if he really pushed himself. The question was whether he should risk everything he had left on what was probably a piece of junk. His phone buzzed. A text from his old college roommate, Tyler. "Hey man, getting worried. You doing okay? Haven't heard from you in weeks." David didn't respond. He was too ashamed to tell Tyler the truth. Tyler had a good job, a house, a family. He'd offer to help, but David couldn't bring himself to ask. He'd already borrowed money from friends twice before and paid it back late both times. He couldn't do that again. He looked back at the tiny house listing. Then he made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, David called the number in the ad. An elderly woman answered on the 5th ring. Her voice sounded tired, maybe even a little irritated. "Yes, the house is still available," she said curtly. "Can you come look at it today? I need it gone by the end of the week." "Yes, I can come today," David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Cash only, $500. No negotiating. The address is 4847 Pinewood Road. Just outside Bend. Come after 2 o'clock. She hung up before he could ask any questions. David spent the rest of the morning doing a rush job for a client who needed a flyer designed. It paid $85, enough to push him over the $500 mark. By noon, he'd withdrawn all his money and counted it 3 times. $512. Everything he had in the world. The drive to Pinewood Road took 40 minutes. The property was set back from the main road, down a long gravel driveway surrounded by overgrown trees and bushes. The main house was a faded yellow color with newspapers piled on the porch. In the backyard, behind a rusty chain-link fence, sat the tiny house. It looked worse in person than in the photo. The structure was maybe 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, mounted on a trailer with flat tires. The white paint had peeled away in large chunks, revealing rotting wood underneath. Several windows were cracked or missing entirely. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. A heavy blanket of moss covered the roof. David's heart sank. This was a mistake. This thing wasn't a house. It was a disaster on wheels. The front door of the main house opened and an old woman stepped out. She had to be at least 80, thin and stooped, wearing a cardigan despite the mild afternoon temperature. She didn't smile or wave, just watched David get out of his car. "You the one who called?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. I'm David. I'm Mrs. Patterson. That's the house." She gestured toward the tiny structure without looking at it. "It's been sitting there for 15 years. Haven't been inside in at least 10. David walked closer to the tiny house, trying to see past the obvious problems. The trailer frame looked solid even if the tires were shot. The structure itself seemed intact, just neglected. Through the grimy windows he could see it was empty inside. "Can I go in?" he asked. Mrs. Patterson shrugged. "Suit yourself. Door's unlocked." "Well, it doesn't lock anymore, so there's that." David climbed the rickety metal steps and pushed the door open. The smell hit him immediately. Mold, mildew, and something else he couldn't quite identify. But there was a floor. There were walls. There was a ceiling. It was shelter. The inside was a single room with a tiny bathroom area sectioned off at one end. Water damage stained the ceiling in several places. The floor felt soft in spots, which wasn't a good sign. But the bones of the structure seemed okay. With a lot of work, a lot of time, and probably more money than he had, this could maybe become livable. "Why are you selling it so cheap?" David asked when he came back outside. Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened. "Because I want it gone. My health isn't good and I'm moving to assisted living next month. I need this property cleared. The house isn't worth anything, so I'm practically giving it away to whoever will haul it off." She paused, then added something that struck David as odd. "Don't blame me for whatever you find in there. That house has secrets I don't care to know about." David wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he was too focused on the immediate problem to worry about cryptic warnings. "If I buy it, can I keep it here for a few days while I arrange to move it?" "1 week. After that, I'm having it taken to the dump whether you've moved it or not." David stood there in that overgrown backyard, looking at the sorriest excuse for a house he'd ever seen. This was insane. This was probably the worst financial decision he could possibly make. He'd be spending his last dollar on a rotting box that might fall apart the moment he tried to move it. But he'd be spending his last dollar on a home, 4 walls and a roof. A door he could close. A space that was his. "I'll take it," he heard himself say. Mrs. Patterson nodded like she'd expected nothing else. They went inside her house where she had the title already filled out and ready to sign. Her hand shook as she signed her name and handed him the document. She took his $500 without counting it and stuffed the bills in her cardigan pocket. "Good luck," she said, though her tone suggested she thought he'd need more than luck. As David drove away that evening, the title to a tiny house sitting on his passenger seat, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but not complete despair either. Something in between. He'd taken a gamble. He'd spent every penny he had on what might be the biggest mistake of his life. But at least it was his mistake. His chance. His possibility. That night, after borrowing Tyler's truck and promising to explain everything later, David towed the tiny house to a friend's property where he'd gotten permission to park temporarily. He swept out the worst of the debris, rolled out his sleeping bag on the questionable floor, and lay there listening to the rain pound on the metal roof. It leaked in 3 places. The wind whistled through gaps in the walls. The whole structure creaked and groaned with every gust, but he wasn't in his car anymore. He had a door. He had walls. He had a roof. David closed his eyes and tried not to think about the fact that he now owned a $500 disaster and had exactly $12 left to his name. Tomorrow he'd start figuring out how to make this work. Tonight he'd just try to sleep in his new home, however terrible it might be. He had no idea that 3 weeks later, he'd discover something beneath the floor that would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since David moved into the tiny house, and somehow, he was still alive. That felt like an accomplishment worth celebrating, even if his celebration consisted of instant ramen and tap water. The first week had been brutal. He'd nearly given up a dozen times. The leaks in the roof had turned into small waterfalls during a heavy rainstorm. The bathroom was completely unusable, and the smell, that horrible musty smell, seemed to be embedded in every surface. But David had learned something important about himself during those weeks. When you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you can endure a lot more than you think. He'd started documenting his renovation work on social media, mostly out of boredom and a desperate need to feel like he was accomplishing something. He'd post photos of the work he was doing with captions like Day 12, fixed 3 leaks, discovered 2 more, and found a family of mice in the wall. They were nicer than my last landlord. Surprisingly, people started following along. Not thousands of people or anything crazy like that, but a couple hundred folks seemed genuinely interested in watching him transform this disaster into something livable. Some of them even sent encouraging messages or tips on how to fix things on a budget. It felt good to connect with people again, even if it was just through a screen. The tiny house community was real, David discovered. People who lived in small spaces, who believed in minimalism, who understood that sometimes you just needed to start over with less. They got it. They got him. By week 3, David had made real progress. He'd patched the roof using materials from a salvage yard. The windows were covered with heavy plastic sheeting until he could afford real glass. He'd scrubbed every surface with bleach and vinegar until his hands were raw. The smell was almost gone. The structure was starting to feel less like a prison and more like a possibility. Money was still impossibly tight. David had picked up some freelance design work through old contacts, enough to buy food and basic supplies. His friend Kevin, who owned the property where the tiny house was parked, had been incredibly generous, refusing to take any rent money. "Just get back on your feet," Kevin kept saying. "That's payment enough." On a cold Tuesday morning in early December, David was working on installing a small wood stove he'd found at an estate sale for $40. It was old but functional, and it would make a huge difference once winter really set in. He'd already cut a hole in the roof for the chimney pipe, and now he was figuring out the best place on the floor to position the stove. That's when he noticed something strange. David had walked across every inch of this tiny house 100 times by now. He knew which boards creaked, which ones felt soft, which ones were solid. But as he was moving around trying different positions for the stove, he stepped on a spot near what would be his sleeping area, and the sound was different. It wasn't just a creak. It was a hollow thud. He stopped and stepped on it again. Definitely hollow, but that didn't make sense. Tiny houses built on trailers had very little space underneath them. The floor sat almost directly on the trailer frame. There shouldn't be any hollow spaces. David grabbed his flashlight and got down on his hands and knees, examining the floorboards more carefully. The boards in that section looked slightly different from the rest. Same type of wood, same age, but the nails were spaced differently, like someone had taken them up and put them back down at some point. His heart started beating faster. He wasn't sure why. It was probably nothing. Maybe previous owners had done some kind of repair work. Maybe there was water damage underneath. Maybe it was completely normal and unremarkable. But David couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something. He went to his car and grabbed his toolbox. The crowbar felt heavy in his hands as he wedged it under the edge of the first floorboard. The wood was old and came up easier than he expected. The nails pulled free with minimal resistance, like they'd been removed and replaced before. He lifted the board away and shined his flashlight into the space below. His breath caught in his throat. There was a compartment under the floor. Not just a small gap, but an actual space, maybe 3 feet deep. Someone had modified the trailer base, cutting away parts of it and creating a hidden storage area. It must have taken significant work and planning, and it wasn't empty. David's hands were shaking now as he pulled up the next board, and then the next. The compartment was about 3 feet wide and 4 feet long. Inside he could see several objects wrapped in what looked like old tarps and plastic sheeting. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs like it had been down there for years. Maybe decades. He reached in carefully and pulled out the first item. It was heavy, much heavier than he expected. The tarp crackled as he unwrapped it, the plastic brittle with age. Underneath was a metal box about the size of a shoebox. It was locked, and rust had formed around the edges and hinges. David set it aside and reached for the next item. Another box, this one larger, then another, and another. In total, he pulled out 6 containers of various sizes, all wrapped carefully, all locked, all clearly hidden on purpose. He sat on the floor of his tiny house, surrounded by these mysterious boxes, his mind racing. What was this? Who had put them here? And most importantly, what was inside? The smallest box had a simple padlock that looked like it might give way with enough force. David grabbed his bolt cutters from the toolbox, positioned them on the rusted lock, and squeezed hard. The lock snapped with a loud crack that made him jump. His hands trembled as he opened the lid. Inside, nestled in rotting velvet cloth that might have once been red or purple, were coins. Lots of coins. But these weren't modern quarters or pennies. These were old silver dollars, gold pieces, coins that looked like they belonged in a museum or a history book. David picked one up carefully. It was heavy, real metal, not like the cheap coins you got as change at the grocery store. He wiped away the dust and could make out a date, 1889. The coin was over 130 years old. He started pulling out more coins, examining each one. Some had dates from the 1880s, some from the 1890s. There were silver dollars with eagles on them, gold coins he didn't recognize, even some old paper currency that had somehow survived all these years. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This wasn't just old stuff. This could be valuable, really valuable. He opened his phone and started searching. 1889 silver dollar value. The results made him dizzy. Depending on condition and which mint made them, some of these coins could be worth hundreds of dollars. Some could be worth thousands, and he had dozens of them, maybe hundreds across all 6 boxes. David sat back against the wall trying to process what was happening. 3 weeks ago, he'd spent his last $500 on this falling-apart tiny house. He'd been living in his car, broke and desperate, with no idea how he was going to survive the winter. Now he was sitting on the floor of that same tiny house, surrounded by boxes that might contain a fortune. His phone rang, making him jump. It was Kevin, probably calling to check on him like he did every few days. David almost answered, almost told him everything right then, but something stopped him. He let it go to voicemail. He needed time to think. He needed to figure out what this was, where it came from, and what he was supposed to do with it. Because this wasn't just finding $20 on the sidewalk. This was finding something that someone had hidden very carefully, very deliberately. Someone who had gone to enormous trouble to create a secret compartment and hide these boxes. Someone who probably expected to come back for them someday. David looked at the 5 remaining locked boxes. If the smallest one contained this many valuable coins, what was in the bigger ones? Part of him wanted to break open every lock right now and see everything. But another part of him, the part that had learned to be cautious after months of hardship, knew he needed to slow down and be smart about this. He took photos of the coins with his phone, then carefully placed them back in the box. He moved all 6 containers to the corner of the tiny house and covered them with a blanket. Then he put the floorboards back in place, hammering the nails in loosely so he could access the compartment again if needed. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept getting up to check on the boxes to make sure they were still there, to convince himself this wasn't some elaborate dream. Every sound outside made him nervous. Every car that drove past on the distant road made him wonder if someone was coming. By morning, he'd made a decision. He couldn't handle this alone. He needed expert help. He needed someone who could tell him what he'd found and what it was worth. But more than that, he needed to know the story behind this treasure, because Mrs. Patterson had said something when she sold him the house, something that hadn't made sense at the time. "Don't blame me for whatever you find. That house has secrets I don't care to know about." She knew. Maybe not exactly what was hidden there, but she knew something was in this house, something someone had left behind, something worth hiding. David picked up his phone and started searching for experts who dealt with old coins and historical artifacts. He was going to find out what this treasure was and where it came from, and then he was going to figure out if any of it was legally his to keep. David didn't sleep for 2 nights. He kept the lights on in the tiny house, jumping at every sound. The boxes sat in the corner covered by a blanket, but he couldn't stop thinking about them, about what they meant, about what could happen if the wrong person found out. On the 3rd day, exhausted and jittery from too much coffee, David made a decision. He needed professional help, but he couldn't just walk into any coin shop with potentially valuable antiques. That seemed like a good way to either get ripped off or become a target for theft. He spent hours researching online, looking for someone trustworthy. That's when he found Dr. Helen Morrison, a history professor at the University of Oregon who specialized in the American West and had been quoted in several news articles about historical discoveries. She seemed legitimate, academic, not the type to try to steal from him or alert the wrong people. David sent her an email, keeping it vague. He said he'd found some old coins and wanted an expert opinion. He didn't mention how many coins or where he'd found them. He definitely didn't mention the 5 other boxes he hadn't opened yet. She responded within a few hours, which surprised him. She said she'd be willing to take a look, but she'd need him to sign a non-disclosure agreement first. That actually made David feel better. If she was worried about legal protection, she was probably legitimate. They met at a coffee shop in Eugene, halfway between Bend and her university office. David had brought just 3 coins in a small plastic bag. Nothing that would draw attention. Dr. Morrison was younger than he expected, maybe in her late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She shook his hand firmly and got right to business. "Let's see what you've got." David handed her the plastic bag. She pulled out a pair of thin white gloves from her purse and slipped them on before touching the coins. That's when David knew this was serious. She wasn't treating these like ordinary objects. Dr. Morrison examined the first coin under a small magnifying glass she'd brought with her. Her expression didn't change, but David noticed her hand pause for just a moment. Then she picked up the second coin. Then the third. Finally, she looked up at him. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were intense. "Where did you get these?" "I found them," David said carefully. "In something I bought." "Is that a problem?" "That depends. Do you have more than 3? David hesitated. This was the moment. He could lie, play it safe, or he could trust this woman he'd just met. Yes, a lot more. Dr. Morrison set the coins down gently on a napkin. "Mr. Chen, these coins are extremely valuable. This one," she pointed to the 1889 silver dollar, "is an 1889 CC Morgan silver dollar. The CC means it was minted in Carson City, Nevada. Depending on its grade and condition, it could be worth anywhere from $500 to several $1,000s. And that's just one coin." David felt his stomach flip. Several $1,000s for one coin. And he had dozens of them. "I need to see the rest," Dr. Morrison said. "And I need to bring in a colleague, someone who specializes in numismatics. That's the study of coins and currency. But before we go any further, I need to know the whole story. Where you got these, how you got them, everything." So David told her. About living in his car. About the $500 tiny house. About the hidden compartment under the floor. About the 6 locked boxes. He didn't mention that he'd only opened one so far. Dr. Morrison listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You said the woman who sold you the house knew there were secrets in it?" "That's what she said. Don't blame me for whatever you find. We need to talk to her. But first, let's see what you actually have. Can I come to your place tomorrow with my colleague? His name is Robert Chen. No relation to you, I assume." David shook his head. No relation. The next day, Dr. Morrison arrived with Robert Chen, a man in his 60s who wore an actual suit despite the fact that they were meeting at a tiny house in someone's backyard. He carried a large case filled with equipment, magnifying glasses, scales, reference books, and things David didn't recognize. David had laid out the contents of the first box on a clean towel. The coins gleamed under the overhead light he'd rigged up. Dr. Morrison and Robert spent nearly 3 hours examining every single piece, making notes, taking photos, cross-referencing with books and online databases. David tried to stay calm, but watching their reactions made that impossible. Every few minutes, one of them would pause, examine a coin more closely, and exchange a meaningful look with the other. Finally, Robert sat back and removed his glasses. "Mr. Chen, do you have any idea what you have here?" "Old coins?" David offered weakly. Robert actually smiled. "That's technically accurate, but wildly understated. In this one box alone, you have approximately $40,000 to $60,000 worth of coins. And that's a conservative estimate. Some of these pieces are quite rare." David felt the room spin. $40,000 from one box. The smallest box? "There are 5 more boxes," he said quietly. Dr. Morrison and Robert exchanged another look. "We need to see them," Dr. Morrison said. Over the next 2 days, they worked through all 6 boxes. David took time off from his freelance work, too anxious to focus on anything else. Box by box, the inventory grew. More coins, different denominations, various mints. Gold coins from the early 1900s. Paper currency in denominations David didn't know existed. Several pieces of old jewelry, including a diamond brooch that made Robert whistle low under his breath. But the biggest surprise came in the 4th box. Underneath a layer of coins wrapped in oilcloth were documents. Old stock certificates from mining companies, property deeds from Nevada and Oregon, and a leather journal, its pages brittle with age, filled with handwritten entries. Dr. Morrison handled the journal like it was made of glass. She carefully opened it to the first page and read aloud. "Property of Samuel Blackwell, 1887. "Blackwell," David repeated. That was Mrs. Patterson's last name. She said her married name was Blackwell. Dr. Morrison started reading through the journal more carefully. It was slow going because the handwriting was old-fashioned and faded, but a story began to emerge. Samuel Blackwell had been a prospector in Nevada during the silver boom of the late 1800s. He'd had some success, Enough to accumulate wealth, but he'd also been deeply distrustful of banks. "Listen to this," Dr. Morrison said, reading from an entry dated October 1893. "Another bank failed today in Sacramento. 3 more men lost everything they had. I will not be among them. My fortune stays with me in places only I know until the day I can trust these institutions again." Samuel Blackwell had been hiding his wealth, burying it, stashing it, keeping it close. The journal contained cryptic references to various hiding spots, but nothing specific enough to find them. Except for one entry from 1896, "Moved the collection to the Cabin Foundation. 4 feet down, sealed in the containers grandfather made. It will wait there until I need it or until I'm gone. May whoever finds it use it more wisely than I have." "The Cabin Foundation," Robert said. "This tiny house was built on the site of an old cabin?" David nodded slowly. "Mrs. Patterson said her husband bought this structure at an estate sale in Nevada. It used to be something else before it was converted into a tiny house. Maybe it was that cabin, or built from parts of it." They spent another full day cataloging everything and researching values. When they finally finished, Robert presented David with a detailed inventory. The total estimated value made David's hands shake, between $1.2 and $1.8 million. David had to read it 3 times before the numbers made any sense. He'd been living in his car 6 weeks ago. He'd spent his last $500 on a falling-apart tiny house. And now he was potentially a millionaire. But Robert and Dr. Morrison were quick to explain that it wasn't that simple. There were legal questions. Lots of them. Who owned the treasure? David had bought the house legally. But did that include hidden contents the seller didn't know about? What about Samuel Blackwell's descendants? Were there any inheritance laws that applied? "The good news," Dr. Morrison said, "is that Mrs. Patterson sold you the house without knowing about this. That's in your favor. The bad news is that this is complicated enough that you need a lawyer. A good one." "I can't afford a lawyer," David said, the reality crashing down on him. "I have maybe $300 to my name." "Any lawyer worth their salt will take this case on contingency," Robert said. "Meaning they get paid when you get paid. But there's something else you need to do first." "What?" "You need to talk to Mrs. Patterson again. Find out what she knows about her husband's family history, about Samuel Blackwell, about why this house sat on her property for 15 years. Because I'll tell you something, Mr. Chen. People don't forget about $1 million treasure by accident. There's a story here, and my guess is that Mrs. Patterson knows at least part of it." That night, David sat alone in his tiny house surrounded by the carefully documented treasure. $1 million, maybe more. Enough money to change his entire life, to never worry about rent or food or sleeping in his car again. But Dr. Morrison's words kept echoing in his mind. There's a story here, and David had a feeling that story was going to be more complicated than he ever imagined. Tomorrow he'd go see Mrs. Patterson again. He'd ask her what she really knew about this house and the fortune hidden beneath its floor. Tonight, though, he just sat there in the tiny house that had cost him everything he had, and wondered how a $500 gamble had turned into something that might change everything. He picked up one of the gold coins, feeling its weight in his palm. Samuel Blackwell had hidden this over 100 years ago, hoping someone would find it someday and use it wisely. David just hoped he could figure out what that meant. David found Mrs. Patterson at Riverside Assisted Living, a quiet facility on the outskirts of Bend. The receptionist told him she'd moved in 2 weeks earlier, right on schedule like she'd planned. Room 147, second floor, overlooking the garden. He knocked softly on her door, half hoping she wouldn't answer. This conversation terrified him. What if she demanded the treasure back? What if she hadn't known about it and now felt cheated? What if she called the police? "Come in," a weak voice called from inside. Mrs. Patterson sat in a chair by the window, looking even frailer than David remembered. She wore a pink cardigan and had a blanket across her lap despite the warm room. When she saw him, something flickered in her eyes. Not quite surprise, more like resignation. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. "You found it, didn't you?" David closed the door behind him and sat in the chair across from her. "Yes, ma'am. I found it." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. "I knew someone eventually would. Should have been me, I suppose. Should have been Richard, but neither of us ever looked in the right place." "Richard was your husband?" 43 years. Her voice carried decades of complicated emotion. "He was a good man in many ways. Hardworking, loyal, kind to animals and children, but he was obsessed with that damn treasure his whole adult life. Mrs. Patterson turned to look at David directly. You want to know the story? That's why you're here. Not to gloat, not to apologize, but to understand what you found and why it was hidden there. Yes, ma'am. She took a deep breath, and the story spilled out. It was a story about family obsession and choices that haunted people for generations. Samuel Blackwell, Richard's grandfather, had been a successful prospector in the 1880s and 90s. Not wildly rich, but comfortable enough to raise a family and own property. He'd lived through several bank collapses and financial panics, watching friends lose everything they'd saved. So Samuel had kept his wealth close, hidden in places only he knew about. Samuel had 3 sons. The oldest, Richard's father, William, had inherited most of Samuel's legitimate assets when the old man died in 1921. But William had always believed his father had hidden additional wealth somewhere. It became a family legend, whispered about at reunions and holiday dinners. Samuel's secret fortune, waiting to be found. William spent years searching, never finding anything. When he died in 1965, he passed the obsession to his son Richard like a curse. Richard was 23 when his father died. Mrs. Patterson said, already married to me with a baby on the way. He was studying to be a teacher. We had a good life planned out. Simple but good. Her voice cracked slightly. Then he found his father's research. Boxes full of old documents, maps, family papers, all of it pointing to Samuel's hidden treasure. And Richard couldn't let it go. Over the next 30 years, Richard Blackwell had chased leads across 3 states. He'd spent thousands of dollars buying old property records, interviewing distant relatives, hiring researchers. Every vacation, every spare dollar, every free moment went into the search. We fought about it constantly, Mrs. Patterson said. I wanted him to let it go, to focus on our life, our daughter, our future. But he couldn't. He'd say just one more lead. Beth, just one more property to check. It was never just one more. In 1998, Richard discovered that Samuel had once owned land in Nevada, where an old miner's cabin had stood. The cabin was long gone, but someone had salvaged the structure and converted it into a tiny house decades earlier. Richard tracked down that tiny house and bought it at an estate sale, convinced the treasure had to be hidden inside or nearby. He searched that house for months, Mrs. Patterson said, tears welling in her eyes, tore apart the walls, checked every board, dug around where it sat on our property. He found nothing. Because he was looking in the walls and ceiling, he never thought to check under the floor. Richard died of a heart attack in 2008, his treasure still unfound. He was 66 years old. Mrs. Patterson had been left bitter and angry. Angry at Samuel for hiding his wealth. Angry at William for passing the obsession to his son. Angry at Richard for choosing a fantasy over their real life together. And angry at herself for staying, for supporting him, for not putting her foot down harder. I had that tiny house towed to the back of the property, and I never wanted to see it again, she said. I couldn't bring myself to go inside. It represented everything Richard had wasted. All the years he spent chasing something that might not even exist. She looked at David with red-rimmed eyes. But it did exist. And you found it. With dumb luck and a $500 gamble, you found what my husband spent half his life searching for. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. David didn't know what to say. Part of him felt guilty, like he'd stolen something that should have been Richard's. Another part felt defensive, like he'd earned this through his own desperate circumstances. I'm sorry, he finally said. I'm sorry your husband never found it. I'm sorry it cost you both so much. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with a tissue. Don't apologize. It's not your fault. If anything, maybe it's fitting that someone who actually needed it found it, instead of someone obsessed with finding it. She paused, then said something that surprised David completely. The treasure is yours. You bought the house legally. I sold it to you without knowing what was inside. That makes it yours under the law, or at least that's what the lawyer I consulted told me 20 years ago when Richard was still alive. You consulted a lawyer. I was so desperate to end Richard's obsession, I looked into whether we could legally claim any treasure he might find on properties he'd bought. The lawyer said if you buy something and find hidden contents the seller didn't know about, those contents are generally yours. Of course, there are exceptions and complications, but that's the basic principle. David felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved. "Mrs. Patterson, I can't just take everything and walk away. Your husband spent his life searching for this. That has to mean something. It does mean something. It means he wasted his life chasing money instead of appreciating what he already had." Her voice was hard, but then it softened. But Richard wasn't all bad. He had dreams too, good dreams, underneath the obsession. She looked at David with an intensity that made him sit up straighter. "If you're going to have that money, I want you to promise me something. Use part of it to help people, not treasure hunters or obsessed fools like Richard, but people who are struggling, people who need a second chance." "What kind of help?" Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment. Richard always wanted to help young people pursue their dreams. Before the treasure consumed him, he used to talk about starting a scholarship fund or something like that. Maybe you could do something like that in his name. Something for people who are down on their luck like you were. Artists, creatives, people who just need a break. David felt his throat tighten. "I can do that. I will do that." "Good." Mrs. Patterson settled back in her chair, looking more tired than before. "Then maybe some good will come from all this. Maybe Richard's obsession will end up helping people instead of hurting them." They sat together for another hour, while Mrs. Patterson shared stories about Richard before the treasure hunt consumed him. The teacher he'd been, the father he'd tried to be, the dreams he'd abandoned. David listened, understanding that she needed to remember the good parts, needed to believe her husband had been more than just his obsession. When David finally left, Mrs. Patterson stopped him at the door. "One more thing. Don't let the money change who you are. Don't let it become your obsession like it was Richard's. Use it, enjoy it, help others with it. But don't let it define you." "I won't," David promised. Driving back to the tiny house that evening, David thought about everything Mrs. Patterson had said, about Richard's wasted life, about obsession and regret, about the importance of knowing what really mattered. He thought about the fact that 6 weeks ago, he'd been sleeping in his car with nothing. He'd bought this tiny house out of desperation, not greed. He'd found the treasure by accident while just trying to make a home for himself. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the universe had a way of giving things to people who needed them, rather than people who desperately wanted them. David pulled into Kevin's property and looked at his tiny house sitting there in the fading light. It still needed work. The paint was still peeling in places. It was still small and imperfect and barely qualified as a home, but it was his home, and beneath its floor, it had held a fortune that was going to change everything. Tomorrow, he'd call Dr. Morrison and start the legal process of claiming the treasure officially. He'd set up that scholarship fund for Mrs. Patterson and Richard. He'd figure out how to use this money wisely. Tonight, though, he just wanted to sit in his tiny house and appreciate the strange, impossible journey that had brought him here. From his car to a $500 gamble to a $1 million discovery. And through it all, the tiny house had been there, patiently waiting to share its secrets with someone who was ready to receive them. 6 months had passed since David found the treasure beneath the floorboards, and his life looked nothing like it used to. But in some ways, it looked exactly the same. The legal process had been complicated but straightforward. With Mrs. Patterson's testimony confirming she'd sold the house without knowledge of the hidden treasure, and with documentation proving David's legitimate purchase, the courts determined he was the rightful owner. There were taxes to pay, authentication fees, and legal costs. But when everything was settled, David walked away with just over $1.4 million. The money hit his bank account on a Tuesday morning in March. David stared at the number on his phone screen for a full 10 minutes, waiting for it to disappear or turn out to be a mistake. But it stayed there. Real. Permanent. Life-changing. His first instinct was to go crazy, buy everything he'd ever wanted, make up for years of struggling. But then he remembered Mrs. Patterson's warning. Don't let the money change who you are. And he remembered Richard, who'd spent his whole life chasing wealth and missed the life he already had. So David made careful decisions. He bought a small house, nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a backyard with space for a workshop. It cost him $180,000, and for the first time in his life, he owned something real. Something permanent. But he kept the tiny house too. After everything it had given him, he couldn't bring himself to sell it or abandon it. He paid off the few debts he had. He bought a reliable car to replace the Honda that had been his home for those dark months. He set up a savings account and invested a good chunk of money with a financial advisor Kevin recommended. He wanted to be smart, to make sure this money lasted. But the most important thing he did was keep his promise to Mrs. Patterson. David established the Richard Blackwell Second Chance Fund with $300,000. The fund provided small grants and assistance to artists, creatives, and people facing financial hardship. Not huge amounts, usually between $500 and $5,000, but enough to make a real difference. Enough to pay someone's rent for a few months while they got back on their feet. Enough to buy equipment for someone starting a business. Enough to be the difference between giving up and keeping going. Mrs. Patterson cried when David told her about the fund. They held a small launch event at the assisted living facility, and David made sure Richard's photo was displayed prominently with the description of his life as a teacher and father, not just as a treasure hunter. Mrs. Patterson squeezed David's hand and said, "He would have loved this. The real Richard, the one I married, would have loved this." David's social media following had exploded after he carefully shared his story. Not the treasure part, not at first. He'd continued documenting the tiny house renovation, and people had fallen in love with the transformation. When he finally revealed the discovery, keeping the exact amount vague for privacy, the story went viral. Hundreds of people messaged him. Some wanted advice, some wanted money, but many just wanted to share their own stories of struggle and survival. David read every message. He responded to as many as he could. And when he saw people who really needed help, people whose stories reminded him of his own dark days, he quietly sent them grants from the fund. But David did something else with the money too, something that became his real passion. He bought rundown tiny houses and RVs from auctions and desperate sellers. He hired people who were homeless or down on their luck, paying them fair wages to help renovate the structures. Then he sold the renovated homes at cost to families and individuals who needed affordable housing. No profit, just covering expenses and creating opportunities. His first employee was a woman named Lisa who'd been living in a shelter with her 2 kids. She'd worked in construction before losing her job and apartment. David hired her to help renovate a tiny house, and she turned out to be incredibly skilled. Within 3 months, she was managing whole projects. His second employee was an older man named Frank who'd been sleeping rough for 2 years after his wife died, and he couldn't afford their rent alone. Frank knew plumbing and electrical work. He became invaluable. One by one, David built a team of people who'd been where he'd been. People who understood what it meant to have nothing and need just one chance to prove themselves. By summer, they'd renovated and placed 8 tiny houses. 8 families who now had homes. 8 people who'd been given the same kind of chance that $500 purchase had given David Tyler. His old college roommate visited in June. They stood in David's workshop, a converted barn on his new property, watching the team work on a particularly rough tiny house they'd rescued from a junkyard. "This is amazing, man," Tyler said. "You could be living on a beach somewhere, doing nothing. Instead, you're here working harder than ever." David smiled. "I tried doing nothing for about a week after the money came through. I was bored out of my mind. This feels right. This feels like the money is actually doing something. You're not worried about running out? You're spending a lot on the fund and these projects. I've got good financial advice. The investments are solid. And honestly, if I ran through all the money helping people get housing, I wouldn't regret it. That would be a good way to spend a fortune." Tyler shook his head in wonder. "You know what's crazy? A year ago you were sleeping in your car, completely broken. Now you're a millionaire and you're still basically living like a normal person." "I am a normal person. I just have more resources now to help other normal people who are struggling." That evening, David drove out to visit Mrs. Patterson. He did that once a week now, bringing her photos of the projects and updates on the scholarship fund. She looked forward to his visits, and honestly, so did he. She'd become like family. "I have something to show you," David said, pulling out his phone. He showed her pictures of the latest tiny house renovation. "This one's going to a single dad with 3 kids. He's been working 2 jobs and living in a motel. Now he'll have an actual home." Mrs. Patterson studied the photos, her eyes soft. "Richard would be so proud of you. Not because of the money, but because of what you're doing with it." "I hope so. I know so." She patted his hand. "You found his grandfather's treasure, but you didn't let it consume you. You're using it to build things, to help people. That's what Richard should have done with his life instead of chasing fantasies. David stayed for dinner, eating mediocre facility food and listening to Mrs. Patterson's stories. When he left, she hugged him at the door, something she'd never done before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping your promise, for remembering Richard the right way, for being the kind of person who deserves good fortune." Driving home that night, David passed the spot where he used to park his Honda behind the laundromat. Rosa, the manager who'd been kind to him during his lowest days, waved from the window. He'd hired her daughter through the scholarship fund to study graphic design. Small world, getting smaller and better. David pulled into his driveway and looked at the tiny house sitting in his backyard. He'd fully restored it now. New paint, new windows, a solid roof. It gleamed in the porch light like a little jewel. He could have gotten rid of it, could have sold it or donated it, but he kept it as a reminder. A reminder of where he'd been, what he'd risked and what he'd found. Not just the treasure. That was almost secondary now. What he'd really found was purpose, direction. A reason to get up every morning that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with helping others survive. David walked over to the tiny house and ran his hand along the side. The wood was smooth and solid under his palm. Hard to believe this little structure had been falling apart 6 months ago. Hard to believe it had held a fortune for over 100 years, waiting for the right person to find it. He thought about Samuel Blackwell, hiding his wealth all those years ago, probably never imagining it would take more than a century to be discovered. He thought about Richard, searching his whole life and never finding what was right under his nose. He thought about Mrs. Patterson, holding on to bitterness until someone showed her a better way to remember her husband. And he thought about himself, 6 months ago, spending his last $500 on a desperate gamble. That gamble had paid off in ways he never could have imagined. Not just in money, though, that had been life-changing, but in purpose, in community, in the ability to be for others what he'd needed for himself. David's phone buzzed, a message from Lisa. "Just finished the Wilson family house. They're moving in tomorrow. You should see the kids' faces. Thank you for this opportunity." David smiled and typed back, "Thank you for the amazing work. You made that house a home." He stood there in his backyard between his real house and his tiny house and felt something he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever: contentment. Not happiness exactly, though he was happy, but deeper than that. A sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The tiny house had given him shelter when he had nothing. Then it had given him a fortune when he needed everything. And now it served as a reminder that the best treasures aren't the ones you find beneath the floorboards. They're the ones you build with your own hands. One person, one home, one second chance at a time. David turned off the workshop lights and headed inside. Tomorrow they'd start on a new project. Another tiny house, another family. Another chance to turn someone's $500 disaster into their $1 million discovery. And that, David thought, was worth more than any treasure Samuel Blackwell could have hidden.